Well, as many of you know, we've spent a lot of time over the last couple of class periods, actually the last couple of weeks, focusing on the pre-revolutionary time period. And now it seems like we're kind of, I don't want to say rushing through the actual event of the revolution, but we certainly are moving at a faster pace. And I guess the main reason why we do that is because, like many events in history, it's important to understand two things, I guess. Actually, maybe three. First of all, why that event happened. And again, as we talk about the revolution and the battles that take place and the people and the details of the revolution, what I want you to not lose sight of is why the revolution happened. It wasn't just a group of people that were angry. It wasn't just a group of people that were throwing their hands up or saying things like, I just don't like the king for no particular reason. I'm just going to rebel. Again, if that were the case, if that were the intent of the Americans or the Patriots, just to sort of rebel for the sake of rebellion, it would have certainly looked bad on an international scale, and it would have made it a lot harder, I think, in a lot of ways, to make allies following the war. And I think that was one of the biggest fears, is that the Americans, being kind of isolated from Europe, were going to have a hard time making friends, making alliances with other international powerhouses out there. We certainly weren't going to be friends with Britain right away. I mean, obviously, we're going to embark upon this long, bloody war with them. But the bottom line was that we were going to need allies. So understanding why the revolution happened, the Patriots having this long laundry list of grievances that they had with the British, is all very well documented in the Declaration of Independence. Again, there's a section entitled British Wrongs, where there is a long bulleted point list of, what the British had done wrong to the Americans. And so the Patriots have a reason. So we spent a lot of time talking about those reasons. Now we're going to talk about the events in class of the actual revolution, the battles that took place, the people involved. But again, not to lose sight of why we fought it, but also not to lose sight of what the results were. We're going to talk about, in the next couple of weeks following the revolution, our country sort of struggling. We win the war, we kind of high-five each other and we say, congratulations, this is awesome. But then the question of now what really does sort of hang over many of the Americans' heads. What do we do now? We don't have a president. We don't really have a government other than the Articles of Confederation, which had lots of holes in it. Now what do we do once we've won this war? So again, over the next couple of class periods, this week and into next week, we're going to talk about the revolution. But I want you to think of it as just that. It was the revolution, but why and then what the results of it were are going to be important factors that we'll be talking about. Okay, the actual strengths and weaknesses, and I know we've discussed this in class, but just so we're all on the same page, the British, on paper, should have won this war, hands down, no questions asked, and they should have won it very quickly. And that was really the mindset of many of the British. However, what they grossly, I guess, in a lot of ways, underestimated was the determination that the Patriots had, was the fact that the Patriots were going to fight with, every last ounce of their effort. They were going to leave nothing to chance. They were going to leave nothing on, in the tank. They were going to leave it all there on the battlefield. So when we look at that left-hand list over here, left-hand column here, there are a number of things or issues or, I guess, points that really do display that the British were, the far superior army. They were more prepared. I mean, you look at this, there were more soldiers. This is going to be huge in the sense that this was going to be a war, at least in theory, that was going to be fought in a style called gentleman's warfare, something that we are going, or I think at this point you've experienced outside of the classroom here, throwing things at each other. Gentleman's warfare was the accepted warfare of the time. Most people considered themselves gentlemen, even soldiers with guns that were killing each other wanted to be perceived as gentlemen, wanted their character and integrity to be in check. And so what they did was they fought in a way that was considered acceptable. You line up, you shoot at your enemy, you wait for a return volley, you advance, you do the same thing over and over and over again. Now in that scenario, in gentleman's warfare, the more soldiers you have, the more advantage you have. If there are 100 soldiers on one side and there are 5 on the other, the 100 soldiers have a substantially better chance of winning that particular battle. Even if those 5 soldiers on the other side are skilled, have great weapons, all that stuff, when you're fighting gentleman's warfare, numbers are going to be a huge contributing factor to who wins. So the British had more soldiers. They also had better soldiers, meaning that they were actual soldiers that were trained, that didn't have regular jobs during the day. They were soldiers, unlike the Americans, who many of them were members of the militia before the Continental Army. They were teachers, lawyers, doctors, you name it. They had all sorts of occupations. They did their work during the day, and at night they came home and they trained. But certainly not to the same extent that the British did. There was more experience on the side of the British. They had fought more wars in the style of gentleman's warfare. The Americans had fought wars or battles, but most of them were with Native Americans. I mean, think about the wars that we've talked about so far. You know, the French and Indian War is really the only major war that many of those Americans or patriots have fought in. And again, that French and Indian War was fought very much in the style of guerrilla warfare, for the simple reason that it was fought in the woods many times, which kind of lends itself to that guerrilla warfare. The British had better weapons, they had more money, and they had a powerful navy. I could just put they had a navy, but the fact that it was powerful, the most powerful navy in the world, made it even that much more daunting to the Americans, who had zero naval vessels. They had merchant ships that they put cannons on called naval ships, but bottom line was they had very limited, and in a lot of cases, I mean, if you really want to break it down, they had no navy. So no navy, and again, a makeshift navy by the middle of the war against the most powerful navy in the world, which makes sense because England is an island nation, needs to protect itself with a navy. So they put a lot of time and effort into their navy. All right, the American side. If they were supposed to lose, how did they actually win? Well, here's the deal. Number one is that they had things like intangible aspects to their fighting style that made them difficult to fight, meaning that they had more to lose. They had determination. You can't measure determination. It's not like we say the Americans had 10 units of determination where the British only had 8. But the bottom line is that when you have more to lose and you leave it all there on the battlefield, like I talked about before, it makes you very dangerous. Because if you're put into a situation where push comes to shove and you might die, you continue to fight because, as Patrick Henry so poetically stated, he says, "Give me liberty or give me death." If you can't give me my freedoms and my liberties, I don't want to live. And so when you're fighting against people who are willing to die for their cause, that's a scary thing. Now the British, again, put yourself in their shoes, they are British soldiers that live in England. They are being told by their king to go over to the colonies and fight. They aren't voluntarily going over there per se. Many of them were just sort of doing their job. And if it's your job to be a soldier, again, you have a little less buy-in. Think about it like this. If the Americans win in the minds of the British before the war breaks out, if the Americans win, the British soldiers get back on a ship and they go back to England where their families are intact, their houses are intact, there's no death and destruction over there because the war's not fought over there. They go back to things being exactly as they were. The Americans, if they lose everything. Not only is the king going to, I mean, you think that he was oppressive before the war, now he's going to squash the colonies if the Americans lose. The second thing is that many of their houses and their livelihoods have been destroyed or at least damaged. So in a lot of ways, the Americans were saying, if we can't win this war, I do not want to live. We both enter this room, only one of us leaves. I mean, those are the kind of things, when you have that mindset, it's kind of scary. The Americans also had that knowledge of the land. We see that playing out in things like Lexington and Concord, as well as the Battle of Bunker Hill, and even Saratoga. There's a lot of instances during the war where the Americans are able to use the land to their advantage. Because even though the British soldiers considered the colonies part of Britain, it was foreign land to them. They didn't know where they were going. European aid. We're going to see the Spanish and the French and other countries send not just money and soldiers, but also ideas and weaponry and materials. There's countless examples, from Poland sending people like Casimir Pulaski, who teaches the Americans how to ride on horses, to, you know, other German states like Prussia sending over like someone like Frederick von Steuben, who's a drill sergeant, and he basically teaches the Americans how to fight on the battlefield. I mean, many of these people were just farmers that owned guns that were out there fighting. They needed a proper training, and other countries around the world were willing to lend not just money and soldiers, but also information to help the Americans along. Because remember, the British are up top, and if they're number one in the world, the most powerful army and navy in the world, other countries want to see them fall. Because as the British fall, those other countries rise up. And that's sort of the mentality here. So we get a lot of European aid. We also have crafty leaders like George Washington, who basically says, I will win at all costs. I will throw caution to the wind. I will think outside the box. I will fight guerrilla warfare, even though I know that that's not an acceptable type of warfare in this, day and age. I am going to do whatever it takes to win. Washington was smart enough to say, if I fight gentleman's warfare style, we lose. So what's the point of even fighting? So he thinks outside the box. He says things like, I don't care if it's construed as cheating or playing unfairly. I'm going to do whatever it takes to win. We also see other leaders like Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin, John Adams. Think of all our founding fathers. These people, they buy into the fact that the pen being mightier than the sword, a kind of a phrase that we're going to come back to throughout the year. They are the ones kind of behind the scenes, not the George Washington on the front of the battlefield, but behind the scenes, drafting documents, creating government styles, communicating, almost sending that propaganda around to all the colonies to get everyone on board. They're doing just as much damage to the British cause than George Washington. So although we're going to see leaders emerge and we're going to see crafty leaders emerge, that's one of those big things that the Americans do, or they have. They have that win-at-all-cost mentality. And the last thing up there is short supply lines. What that means is that factories that were creating or building or constructing guns and ammunition and cannons and uniforms were located in the colonies that were providing the colonies with that stuff. The British were still being provided 2,000 miles away from factories in England. So if they needed more guns and materials and ammunition and all that stuff, they needed to send for it 2,000 miles away to get it. Now, of course, they had ships constantly coming and going, and it wasn't a huge issue. It certainly was an advantage that the Americans had.